This video will be the second part to the first video, where I'll help clarify things in this video that my first video unfortunately wasn't able to clarify to anyone. And now we'll start. You see right here two particles, both spinning. One's in the state of 0, another in the state of 1. As you see here, this is how classical bit of information, functions, as opposed to two particles that are entangled with each other and exhibiting a state of quantum entanglement, which leads to quantum bit of information, or a qubit. With enough bits of information, the image of a square, for example, is something which can be stored, processed, and accessed, though within a certain amount of time, while a qubit will be able to not only process information representative of a square, but that it can be processed at an even faster rate. Now imagine if quantum entanglement wasn't limited to just two particles at a time, but every other particle in existence, meaning every particle were able to entangle itself to every other particle. Then the computing power and speed of such a system would be enormous, infinite even. That's what we get when we get quantum entanglement. In general, since the transfer speed, which allows for the conventional idea of quantum entanglement to occur, would have no other means to do so, if the processing speed that it would gain by having a particle entangle itself to every other particle wasn't there to aid in that endeavor. Furthermore, if a particle were able to entangle itself to every other particle in existence, then the type of information that it would be able to process would essentially look like that of physical reality. And to take it a step further, by having a quantum computer on a scale as massive as the universe itself, what would surely emanate from such an arrangement as that entails the ability for said system to be manipulated at the source, which is basically another way of saying the code of a particle would experience that of being reprogrammed, the same way that individual particles as a whole are used to help make programs, with the difference here being that the individual particle wouldn't need to be used as a bit of information for the program, and instead for the particle to have within itself the entire computer, as opposed to it being a program to code at best. This is what manufactured continuity is, the editing of information at the source, as if the frames used in animation were also found within particles at a subatomic level, which would allow for the altering of these frames to have a real-world effect on the nature of reality. Whereas for quasi-dimensionality, the oscillation feature being utilized between shapes so as to allow for the formation of dimensions, which can only come about through having these shapes connect to each other, and how that feature would serve in making particles behave in the exact manner that they are prone to doing so, suggests that the wavelength is actually the medium used to hold and transfer the information within all particles. Similarly to how DNA does this very thing for the cells in our body. On top of that, because the wavelengths which exist within the wavelengths of a particular particle are constantly going through the experience of having themselves expand as they move from one side of the particle to the other, given that the set area of a particle forces it to take the wavelengths which make it up and have them extend and contract within certain parts of the set area, or the field of wavelengths, which is what makes up the particle, so that it may allow for the rest of the wavelengths to make their way to the other side of the particle. What you have in this process is that of the spin, as in the particle spin is really just the various wavelengths of a particle going through the experience of extending and contracting the size of each wavelength. And since the wavelength of a particle can appear as if it's extending and contracting, then it's also feasible to imagine that having a particle approach another particle would cause it to become ensnared by the growing appearance of the particles cluster of wavelengths, even though it may appear from the outside looking in that the particle's wavelengths are not being affected by the wavelengths of the other particle due to there being space between them. But because the wavelengths of each particle from the perspective of the particle would allow for the appearance of an alignment in each of these particles' clusters of wavelengths, the physical distance between each particle would fail to prevent that of having each particle's wavelengths become influenced by the wavelengths of the other particle. And finally, the reason why quantum entanglement, which involves the entanglement of every particle, is what serves in making the notion of using mathematics to calculate the dynamics between particles as such scales, a methodology which would be inadequate at achieving this is because the wavelengths of a shadow particle having the capacity and inevitability to reach sizes as small as or even smaller than that of the Planck scale, along with wavelengths embedded within wavelengths serving as portals to future and past representations of the universe, which is just one way that a particle would have its spin affect the spin of another particle, with the other way involving the wavelength of a shadow particle reverberating across space-time by having its wavelength in a small enough state to have it move past every typically sized non-shadow particle's influence on its velocity would then cause the mathematics which are based on calculating the nature of objects operating under linear conditions, such as having particles which wouldn't move both forward and backward in time, to become ineffective at predicting the position of a particle within a landscape of literally infinite proportions, as well as for it to be an inefficient approach to take when the entanglement of particles across the entirety of both space and time would allow for the seamless accessing of information within an instant and without the need to involve a process as extensively exhaustive with as tedious protocols as conventional mathematics tends to be. That's what utilizing superposition numbers in this endeavor is all about. Like I said in the first video, you can have an elaboration on what I said in both videos through my books, which you find the links to in the description. Hopefully this will help.